All right, everyone. Yeah, it's A. Thank you guys all for coming to the next session for week 4, the fourth and final week of our first year experience summer series. Today we have our presenter, Joan. She is from Northwest Indian College. She is their student education's program director. So we're super excited to have her here. Just to get her introduced, I'm going to read her speaker bio. So Joan is a mother of three children and a grandmother. Ms. Bannell works at Northwest Indian College as a Student Connections Program Director, which focuses on improving GPA, persistence, retention, and graduation rates for students using holistic coaching, advising, and peer mentoring. She is a university graduate, earning her master's in adult education from Western Washington University, and holds a graduate level certificate in Indigenous Research and Methodology from Sitting Bull College. Ms. Bennell is a certified academic life coach and has many years of direct experience advocating for individuals of diverse ability to access and achieve their learning goals. So let's all give a big welcome to Joan, and I will give her the virtual floor.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally. Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA and Accommodations. And I am the youngest daughter of post-World War II European immigrants. That's my mom and dad came over after World War II and had 9 kids. I'm the youngest daughter. I am a non-native guest employee of Northwest Indian College, which is located on the Lummi Nation, located in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm up here in the northwest corner. And today, what I want to share with you is both professional and personal, but I also hope to learn from you as well. And I know that, any topic such as this, we're going to have some experts in the room. And if there's anyone that, feels that we need immediate correct information, please feel free to jump right in. My goal is to expand awareness and knowledge of how to support students with disabilities to obtain their rights to equal access to their education. There's numerous resources for ADA and accommodations on YouTube. There's different organizations, there's government websites. I've included a few at the end of this, and I'll make those links available and the slides as well, so if anybody wants them. And again, I am not a legal expert in ADA policy and law. I'm just a professional who has spent most of my working career working with education and helping students to access accommodations. So here's a little visual, and this is why we have a need for equal access. So we've got all these different animals, and we've got the test proctor, and it says for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb the tree. And so some of these, they're natural climbers, some aren't. But with the right accommodations, everybody can get into the tree. So that's kind of why we have these laws. So back in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and then in 2008 there were certain amendments that increased the understanding of it. Along with that, we're going to talk about the definition of disabilities and major life activities. We're going to go into some diagnosed, undisclosed, undiagnosed disabilities, and then faculty support. Talk about how students can get accommodations, give some examples of those accommodations, and then I'll share those resources, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. And so I'm really happy that we have people joining us today to learn more about this. And the more people that are aware, the more that we can support people with disabilities. So it's a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination with disabilities in all areas of public life. So this includes jobs, schools, transportation, all public and private places that are open to the general public. It was enacted in 1990, and then in 2008, the Amendments Acts emphasized that the definition of disability in Section 504 and ADA should be interpreted to allow for broad coverage. So instead of having a really narrow definition of what a disability is, it took into consideration the uniqueness of all disabilities and individuals and created a broader definition. And so, word for word, a disability under the ADA is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or a record of such an impairment. So for example, someone that may have had cancer but is now cured or is in remission, even though they are cured or in remission, they still would be considered to have a disability under the Act. Or if there's someone that is regarded as having an impairment. So example, again, a person with burn scars who is not impaired in any way, but is discriminated against because someone assumed they were impaired. So it's about the whole idea of just protection of people so they can access their rights. Major life activities, if you think about what you do in a daytime, you know, it starts with getting up, waking up, provided you slept well the night before. Get up and get out of bed and get ready for the day. And, you know, those are things that pretty much most of us can do with little or no difficulty. Those are the things like such caring for ourselves. Within that broad major life activity, we have such things as breathing, walking, talking, hearing, seeing, sleeping, performing manual tasks, learning, reading, thinking, and working. So these are all major activities that we might not be aware of when we're doing them, but when we can't do them or when we're impaired, it becomes really obvious. And then other major life activities are the major bodily functions, such as your immune system functions, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. These can all have manifestations as disabilities that can prevent you from enjoying those major life activities. So now that we have an understanding of what a disability is and what a major life activity, we're going to learn how that comes about with our colleges. And so any college or university that receives federal funds must ensure equal access to students with disabilities. So that means they must provide reasonable accommodations. Accommodations and program modifications should be individually designed to meet the needs of the student with the disability. So that's, again, the broad definition of a disability and the broad definition of accommodations based on what that individual needs. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all. It is a one-to-one. What does that specific individual need to help them climb that tree? And the process to access accommodations and the documentation process has to be readily accessible and flexible to support students if a student's disability impacts his or her ability to clearly describe the need for accommodation. So students with disabilities, if they have no way of knowing how to get the accommodations, or if it's really hard to find, or if it's several steps on a website, may not want to pursue those accommodations. So it's important that everyone that's seeking accommodations knows exactly how to request them. So disabilities are really interesting for students in the education world of trying to access their education. my own personal story with disabilities is back in the day, years and years ago, I was at the University of Washington. I was in my second year, and I was in an English class, and I thought I was pretty bright. I never really had to study in high school, and I could get my homework done the night before. But when I got to college, I started to hit this wall of not being able to organize my time, not being able to get things done, and I was failing. I'd already flunked 2 quarters in a row, and so instead of taking a step back and taking easier classes, I thought I just need to try harder. So I signed up for my 200 level classes, and I'd already lost my Pell Grant because my grade point average had dropped, and I was working to pay for my education instead of using the grants. And I got to midterms in my English class, and back in the day we didn't have computers, but we had these blue books, and they were a little notebook that you would take your test in. And so the instructor would write the question on the board in chalk, and then you would write the answer in pencil in your little testing booklet and then turn it in, and then the instructor would grade it. So I remember sitting there, and it was midterms, and I looked at the question and I looked at my blue book, and I just wrote across the front, "I can't do this." And I gave it to my instructor, and I thought, this is it. I'm done with school. I have to go home and tell my parents. And my parents were okay with us living at home as long as we were going to school. And I thought, okay, I guess I'm just going to be a worker now and not a student. But then the next day, my instructor reached out to me and said, have you ever been tested for a disability? And what does that mean? I'm not disabled. And so I actually went through that process and found out that I did, in fact, have a disability. And as a result of working with the Disability Resource Center there, I got accommodations, and my grade point went way up, and I was able to pass and graduate, and eventually became an elementary school teacher. And because of that interaction, I'll never forget what that faculty member did for me. And just took one person to make a difference in my life. And so that's why this topic is super important to me. So I had an undiagnosed disability, and now it became a diagnosed disability. So once I had that diagnosed, I was able to use that information and apply it to other classes and use that same access. And I received reasonable accommodations, and it made the educational environment for me more accessible, and I was able to, like I say, eventually graduate. So if I had gone there knowing I had a disability, I would have gone to the resource center and said, hey, this is my documented disability. These are the accommodations that I have received in the past. I'd like to continue to receive these. Help me write a letter so all my instructors will know what accommodations will help me be successful. But that, I didn't have that luxury at the beginning, but from then on, I was able to have that. So students who seek accommodations are responsible for documenting the nature and the extent of the disability. So it was my responsibility to get that disability documented and share that with the Resource of Disability Office, or the Office of Disability Resources, sorry. Getting those accommodations is a process. You can't just write on your college application that, I have ADHD or I struggle with this. It could be something you're disclosing in a letter, but it's not going to take you the step forward to actually get those accommodations. If you're a student that is coming from high school who had an IEP, it's, again, you need to make sure you work with your Office of Resources and Disabilities to get that information documented so you can get that letter. Sometimes you don't want to disclose your disability. You're not required to. there's so many people out there with disabilities that are unseen, who get along fine and don't have any need to disclose it. The school is not required to provide you with any accommodations, so that's certainly something that can work for people. You also have, the students that just choose not to self-identify and they just live with it, and that's fine. That works for them. So here's the path to getting your ADA accommodations. So all federally funded institutions are required to provide a reasonable accommodation without causing undue hardship, significant difficulty, or too expensive to provide. You could have, request of maybe getting some note-taking assistance, but to have a learning aid would be something completely different, where they'd have to hire someone. That would be too expensive. So they have to be reasonable. That's the key word. And these accommodations, they exist for a reason. They're not meant to give students an advantage, but to allow equal access to your education. So if you think again of the example of the tree and the rules, everyone's got to climb the tree. Some of those accommodations are going to be different depending on what your needs are. It just levels the playing field. It just allows everyone to show what they're capable of doing. You can apply online with your college student disability coordinator or your staff person who performs this role. At our college, we don't have a disabilities coordinator. We have a staff member who serves as that point person for disabilities. The larger colleges will have offices with multiple employees, not so much when you're a smaller college. It's important that you are prepared to provide documentation of your disability and any suggested accommodations. If you have gone to, depending on how you get your documentation, it could be a medical professional, it could be an educational psychologist who's specifically trained in learning disabilities. Usually that identification, that intake will end up with some suggested recommendations of accommodations that you can take to have written into the letter. And so that person that helps you access, that access coordinator, will have a one-to-one intake meeting to determine what accommodations are going to be best for you. And you'll be able to sit and draft that letter together so you're able to inform your instructors. This next step, it differs from school to school. Some students have that letter automatically sent to their instructors the start of every either quarter or semester. Some places require that the student have a meeting with that instructor, so that student can discuss the accommodations with the instructor. It really depends on what your school requires, and also the comfort level of the student. It's not easy to talk about disabilities with a stranger. You're not expected, you're not required to disclose your disability, just what would help you learn, what are the requested accommodations. Because of the stigma associated with disability and also the stereotype, certain words put out there create certain associations in people's minds, and right away there is this kind of assumed performance capability. So the focus on these letters is, what are the accommodations? And here are some examples of some accommodations. One of the most common ones are extended time on assignments, having large assignments broken into smaller chunks. So let's say you've got that final project that's due at the end of the quarter. You could ask to have different parts of it due throughout the quarter. and get reminders of when those are due. So if you were K through 12, you would be under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. For K through 12, that's where you get an IEP and 504. But under ADA, and it becomes 504 for higher ed institutions. So if you've been in high school with an IEP, and typically you'll get a transition meeting from transitioning from K to 12 to higher ed, that's a good time to invite the college disability resource officer into that meeting and be part of that transition discussion. But if you haven't done that, you still have that document that will help you understand, what accommodations will work best for you. Another accommodation is priority registration. That allows students with disabilities to have first choice of the classes that they need. And so that gives a little more equity, especially with some disabilities where there may be that inability to plan and they're registering last minute and the classes they want are no longer available. So priority registration is definitely something to consider if you're not doing it already, to think about that. Testing modifications is another big accommodation. It would include more time, maybe someone reading the test to you, someone writing the answers for you that you tell them, and it could happen in a separate room. I think this has been harder to do with more of the Zooming that's been going on, but there are ways to get those accommodations in place if you need a separate room. Another thing for students that are living away from home, housing accommodations. Most student housing is federally funded, and so it's required by law that those accommodations are honored within the housing. And so maybe a student needs to get that first floor apartment. Maybe they need to have, an apartment that has noise reduction in it. Whatever the disability needs to be accommodated and it's federally funded, then the housing, if it's reasonable, has to take that into consideration. And then also getting your textbooks in an alternate format. And it could be a textbook that is one that you can listen to, or one that large print. Just having that ability to get that information fairly equitably as anyone else. And then course substitution. So if there are courses that you're not able to take because you're substantially impacted by your disability, this is something you can look at. Are there similar courses that I can take that would allow me to meet the learning requirements, but not this specific course? And then again, reduce course load and extended time to complete course requirements. So students with disabilities, the Pell Grant has a certain number of credits that students are required to take in order to maintain the level of funding. Students with a disability could request to have a reduced course load and still maintain their Pell level of funding. And that's a conversation to have with your disability resource officer. And then again, individuals can use all of their accommodations or one or two of them. The ones that work are the ones that you get to use, and these letters are not permanent, they're flexible. They can be updated, edited, based on what the student needs. So we talked earlier about undiagnosed disabilities and faculty support. So I also work as an adjunct faculty, and so I get to sit in on different faculty meetings and things, and I hear about some of the frustrations of students who aren't turning their work in on time. And to me, when I hear these things, I wonder, oh, is that potentially a student who has difficulty with organizing or difficulty focusing? Maybe it was a student that wasn't getting enough sleep. And so I start to think of, not only how do we support these students, but like that one instructor did for me, is there a way to encourage the student to look at the potential of getting a diagnosis for a disability? But in the meantime, the faculty can support students with suspected disabilities and actually support all students by creating a learning environment that increases educational access for all. So whenever an instructor puts anything online to read, or it should be, I mean, there's accessibility checkers now that will tell you, can everybody read this? Can everybody understand what you're trying to say? Is there a better way to organize the information so students can access it? I like to see disability resource information in a syllabus, and then class announcements about how do I access the accommodations? Who are the staff that can help me navigate that process? And then again, we have this universal design principle, which if your classroom is set up in a way that it makes it access for everyone. And some of the more extreme disabilities might not be met with universal design, but again, it's things like well-organized syllabi, well-developed Zoom modules. How many times does a student need to click to find the assignment? How clear are the steps to submit an assignment? How does the student find the resources to support that assignment? So it's just things that in general make it more equitable for everyone. And then super important that staff, students, faculty respect the student's right to privacy and don't discuss their disability with others. In my position, I work with students who have disclosed, but not to the rest of the world, who suspect, just a lot of trust to be able to come forward and discuss that they have a disability or they think they have a disability. And so for me, I have to be really honoring that trust and not discuss that with anyone else but them. Unless they want to have a meeting to facilitate that discussion with the instructor, that's something I can do. And any student is able to approach their instructors and talk about accommodations. It does not have to be official in place to ask an instructor for more time or for maybe a weekly class meeting. So there's ways to support disabilities without having to get that letter of accommodations. And the more that these discussions happen, the more it's going to be accepted that pretty much most of us have some type of disability. We all have our strengths, we all have our challenges, and being able to honor those challenges is so important. Here are some resources. So the National Center for College Students with Disabilities, incredible amount of information there. And then just your ADA and your rights as a college student. Your Association on Higher Education Disability, AHEAD, has regional technical assistant resources for each of the regions around the United States, and they provide training, workshops, templates, support people to talk to. They're a great organization. And then the database for campus disability resources, again, another rich source of information. Okay. Does anybody have any questions at this point? or would like to share scenarios. Or specific disability accommodation discussions. One of the things that I have really worked on over the last couple of years has been the study of procrastination. Why do people procrastinate? And so that led to a discussion of motivation. Adriana, do you have a question?
Actually, Joan, there is a question in the chat.
Okay.
Catherine says, do you know if private colleges are required to honor the ADA or Section 504? And may we learn about Judith Human? May her memory be a forever blessing.
So the first question is, any institution that receives federal funding has to provide ADA or Section 504. If that private college is open to the general public, it does as well. So the best way to go about is go to one of those resource sites and you can look up the name of the college and it will tell you if they're providing accommodations or not. And so there are there's some very small private colleges that are totally privately funded, and it's almost like the private clubs that aren't required to provide accommodations because they're not open to the public. And so and some of these private colleges may already be providing these accommodations as part of what they do for their student population. But again, I'm not a policy expert, but those resources, especially the AHEAD regional ones, will help you navigate whatever institution you're trying to seek accommodations for, because then there's the whole process. If you're denied accommodations, then you can look at, what are my options? Do I go to a new school or do I challenge that? Is this a legal challenge? And how do I get support? It took years and years of advocating and incredible stories of people who, because of a disability, they weren't allowed to work, but they wanted to work. And so they fought and they pushed, and they were finally in, 1990 being allowed to have this incredible wide scope act that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. And I am not good with names, so Judith Human. Catherine, would you like to explain and share with us?
Judith Human was she's the reason we have the ADA now. She crawled up those stairs at the Capitol to go advocate for accommodations. Her story's on that's called Crip Camp, and yeah, very thankful for her.
Well, thank you for bringing her up. I remember the visual imagery. I just didn't remember the name. And so without people like that, brave people, but just people that want, to enjoy life like everyone else. I mean, why not go to work if you want to? I think that's incredible. It's not, when you think about it, our students, the struggle just to be able to take a test like everyone else, just to be able to have that ability to earn good grades like everyone else, it just needs that specific accommodation. And for my own personal story, I waited. I went to college. I didn't really like it because of how hard it was. So I waited 25 years to get my master's. But boy, when I started my master's, I just dove in and used all of those accommodations. And within 25 years, there's a huge difference too in just the acceptance of disabilities and the wonderful supports that are out there. I was able to really do well. and enjoyed, that opportunity. Okay, so I see a question from TJ. For students who aren't diagnosed, how do you suggest they work with their college to receive a diagnosis and accommodations? That is such a great question. And that something I, on a regular basis, for the students that suspect they have a disability, how do they go from that suspicion to actually getting those accommodations? So one way is, if you're working with an instructor and you know the accommodations that you need and the instructor is willing to provide them, then you can skip that process. You can just, that instructor who's either providing the universal design or the accommodations you request, like keeping the assignment open a little bit longer or helping you break it into chunks, that's fine. You're getting those accommodations without the official letter. But if you need to get the diagnosis, then it's going to be upon you to find those resources. If you're working with a college that has an office of disability resource, they will likely have some names of maybe an educational psychologist who can do that whole intake with you. Maybe there's specific medical professionals who you can work with to get that diagnosis. Sometimes the front page of your IEP may be enough if you're recently out of high school and that diagnosis is still current. The other way you could go about it is working with vocational rehab or tribal voc rehab. Those services are given to you at no cost. With vocational rehab, you definitely would start with an intake with them, and they would, provide it on the demand for services. Sometimes there's a waiting list, sometimes there's not. They can help you with the cost of getting the intake and the testing, and that would lead to the documentation. And then you can provide that documentation to your college. Sometimes it's something you might do online and you would upload that documentation. The nice thing about vocational rehab or tribal voc rehab is that you have a case manager who helps you with the other things that go along with disabilities, because anyone that has a disability knows it's not just about dealing with the disability. There's the emotion around it, the exhaustion. There's some people get compliments, oh, you're so high functioning. High functioning just means exhausted because you're working so hard to be at the level where everyone already else is. So that was a great question. And I'm also available if anybody has questions afterwards. My email will be on the last screen. I'm more than willing to help you find the resources in your area. One of the most prevalent disabilities that I have come across has been the ones related to focusing. And I was talking a little bit about motivation and the relationship between procrastination and motivation, and looking at motivation in terms of task initiation. How do I get started? How do I find, where's that switch so I can get things done? And some of the students I work with that have the executive functioning, which is the part of the brain that helps you to organize things and understand time and get to places you want to be and finish assignments, their disability can be their superpower, where they get the razor sharp focus and produce incredible work, or it can also be that kryptonite where it's completely debilitating and the work just doesn't get done, and then the emotions of not getting the work done. So, we talk about accommodations in the classroom, but also, what about in general life? Just how do you deal with supporting your own particular disability, or if you know someone who has a disability, what are the supports that you can offer that you might not be aware of? That would be super helpful. And I think having conversations with people about well, how does that affect you when you're doing your grocery shopping, or how does that affect you when you need to get somewhere? How can I support you in a way that's positive and very helpful? So having a disability can be, like I said, it can be exhausting, but it also can be, amazing to be able to do things that other people can't once you get that accommodation. But the executive functioning and focusing can manifest as, attention deficit disorder, attention hyperactive disorder, and it's pretty much just a spectrum now called attention deficit disorder. So there's people that have maybe a little bit, or people that are really struggling with the ability to stay focused, the ability to complete work. And so looking at that, working with someone from Voc Rehab or working with your mental health workers can help support students with the emotional part, the exhaustion of those particular disabilities. Trauma is known to manifest as focusing disabilities as well. So students who have experienced trauma will often have a disability that is related to focusing. And if you think about, that whole ability to either stay and the fight, flight, or freeze, that's an executive functioning. Impulses and stimuli is coming in. What do I do? Do I stay here? Do I run? Do I fight? And so when the brain is developing under those circumstances, the focusing is different than the brain that isn't. The brain that's more, mainstream with how academia is designed. So one of the things that I think faculty, can do is to look at different ways of demonstrating knowledge. I think, our students can be highly visual, and producing some type of visual documentation of understanding the assignment, that's, could be a nice alternate assignment to actually doing the writing. Not a replacement, but, having alternating assignments for everyone. So, are there any other questions? Let's see.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions in the chat or anyone raising their hand. So thank you again so much, Joan, for giving that wonderful, very in-depth and thorough presentation on that. Very appreciate it. For everyone who's attending, there is Joan's contact information in case you guys want to use her for a future resource, or just to connect with her as well. Cool. And now I'm going to share my screen so I can show you guys what we're working on next. Okay. So now that we're done with week 3 and getting started with week 4, we are gonna go ahead and have a new survey link. So for everyone who's been attending our sessions or looking at the recordings, we invite you guys to do the survey at the end for each week. Each survey that you guys submit and each sessions that you attend gives you a chance to win some awesome prizes. So this is the QR code here for week 4 survey. So you guys can scan that, or you guys can also look out for it on email or through our social media as well. Here are some of the prizes that you guys can get. So like I said, if you guys attend one session and do one survey, you guys get entered in for a gift card. 2 sessions and 2 surveys, you get entered in for some headphones. 3 sessions and 3 surveys, you can be entered for an Amazon Fire tablet. And then 4 or more sessions and surveys gets you entered in for the grand prize of a laptop. Also coming up this week, on the 24th is going to be our closing celebration for first year experience summer series. So if you guys, at the end of the session, we're gonna have a student panel with some Q&A questions and responses. So if you guys want to submit a question that will be covered in the closing session, feel free to submit them here through this QR code. And yeah, so we are just about done. Here's our schedule, getting very to the bottom of things. So coming up tomorrow at 3 p.m. Mountain Time will be all about internships with Veronica. So we'll be excited to have you guys all back. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and our team. Let's see. And then looking at the chat, Adriana went ahead and posted the survey link in the chat. And then Ashlyn, yes, so all of the sessions are on Zoom. And then if you guys miss anything, you guys can go to our YouTube page as well. Any more questions? Awesome, sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We'll see you guys all tomorrow. Bye. I'll go on it.